Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. And let me start by wishing you a happy All Saints Day. My name's Ryan Anderson, and I have the great privilege of serving as the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. For the past 17 years, it was Ed Whalen who would have been the one introducing tonight's speaker. But after 17 years of stellar leadership, Ed passed the baton to me earlier this year. Because of COVID, we never really had a chance to honor Ed and his leadership. So if you would, please just join me for 1 minute of applause to honor Ed Whalen. He's right up here in the front. Now, part of the great privilege of being Ed's successor entails that I have the great pleasure of being George Weigel's boss. George is someone I've learned a great deal from over the past 20 or so years of my adult life, and I know that we're in a real treat tonight with his 20th annual William E. Simon Lecture. These Simon Lectures have covered a lot of territory, from the philosophy of freedom to just war theory, from a unique reading of the First World War to the challenges of American democracy in the 21st century. Many of these lectures have anticipated the key issues and arguments of today. All of them have been animated by George's distinctive combination of philosophical, theological, and political insight. And I'm sure tonight will be no different. Let me just, without any further ado, say I want to thank the Simon Foundation. The William E. Simon Foundation has been supporting George's work and these lectures for over 20 years, and without their support, this wouldn't be possible. And then I'll just note that following the lecture, there will be a reception just across the hall, and there will also be book sales and book signing, thanks to the Catholic Information Center for providing the book sales. And so please join me in welcoming George Weigel.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and good evening to everyone. I want to assure all of you who are here tonight, as well as all of you who will see the video of this lecture later, that the Ethics and Public Policy Center is in very competent hands with Ryan Anderson, and we're all delighted to have him as part of this enterprise. At the outset of this 20th William E. Simon Lecture, I too want to thank the Simon Foundation, its board and its staff for their generous and stalwart support of my chair at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and of this annual lecture. Bill Simon was a remarkable man, a successful businessman, a distinguished American public servant, immortalized in Doonesbury, no less, and a generous, innovative philanthropist. I hope these lectures and other aspects of my work have helped extend his legacy over time. My remarks at this 20th anniversary lecture will develop themes from previous Simon lectures, focusing them through the prism of the question, what kind of pope do we all, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, others, need at this critical crossroads moment in the civilizational history of the West? Let's begin to reflect together on that question by stepping back into the 19th century. The scene is the village of Alton in England's West Midlands, southeast of the growing industrial metropolis of Birmingham. The date is October 2nd, 1873. The occasion is the dedication of a new Catholic seminary, St. Bernard's, and in an age of magnificent ecclesiastical oratory, the preacher was a man whose sermons are still being read, studied, and prayed over today. The great John Henry Newman, the founder of the reforming Oxford movement within the Church of England, whose study of church history had led him into full communion with the Catholic Church some 30 years before. The seminary's opening was a moment of great satisfaction for men and women with living memories of Great Britain's harsh anti-Catholic penal laws, which were inaugurated by Henry VIII's introduction of serial monogamy into the British royal family. Surely the dedication of such an institution as St. Bernard's meant that a tide had turned. Hadn't Newman himself, speaking at the First Provincial Council of English Bishops in 1852, 2 years after the English Catholic hierarchy was restored after a hiatus of almost 300 years, preached a sermon entitled The Second Spring, looking forward to a new era of Catholic fervor in English history. True, one could never be sure when the deeply ingrained post-Reformation contempt for Catholicism that Newman noted in 1852 would rear its ugly head again. In 1873, however, the dedication of the Alton Seminary made the future look bright, as Catholics took their place in an increasingly tolerant British society, one that, notwithstanding its remaining prejudices, seemed deeply biblical and thoroughly Christian. Yet Father Newman, whom the Church would recognize as a saint in 2019, did not offer the celebratory remarks many were expecting in his Alton sermon. Rather, he described in striking terms the challenges future priests trained at St. Bernard's would face. He said, "I know that all times are perilous, and that in every time serious and anxious minds, alive to the honor of God and the needs of men, are apt to consider no times as perilous as their own. And all times have their special trials which others have not. And I will admit that there were certain specific dangers to Christians at certain other times which do not exist in this time. Still, I think that the trials which lie before us are such as would appall and make dizzy even such courageous hearts as St. Athanasius, St. Gregory the Great, or St. Gregory the Seventh. And they would confess that, dark as the prospect of their own day seemed to them severally, ours had a darkness different in kind from any that has gone before it. For Christianity has never yet had the experience of a world simply irreligious. A world simply irreligious. What did John Henry Newman mean by that? He certainly knew that there were many pious men and women in 19th century England, including luminous Christian spirits like his old Anglican comrade-in-arms, Edward Pusey. And were he alive today, Newman would surely recognize that for all the inroads secularization has made in the past century and a half, there are many devout souls in the West in the mid-21st century, Jews and Christians for whom the God of the Bible continues to disclose the truth of the human condition and continues to empower lives of decency, honor, courage, and compassion. What Newman meant by a world simply irreligious was not then a world without religious believers. Rather, he meant a world in which biblical faith and the biblical view of human nature, human community, human origins, and human destiny no longer shaped culture, society, and public life in a decisive way. What Newman saw aborning was a barren human landscape, a world without transcendent reference points of any sort. This was indeed something new. Biblical religion had long contended with false gods, superstitions, and heresies. Something different and ominous was now shaping the future, Newman suggested in 1873. What was coming was a claustrophobic world, closed in on itself, without windows, doors, or skylights. A world of spiritual emptiness that human beings could only organize against each other. A world in which the biblical view of the human person would be regarded as a grave threat to a more decent future. Such a world, Newman feared, would be far more inhumane than anything found in the classical world he knew so well. And that world would be all the more dangerous because of an unwarranted confidence in its power to facilitate personal happiness, a just society, and endless progress. 80 years and 2 world wars later, another English Catholic, the cultural historian Christopher Dawson, picked up the analysis where Newman left off. Post-World War II Western civilization, Dawson insisted, was not pagan. Paganism was replete with religious sentiment. Something else was going on in the mid-20th century West. The millions who had abandoned biblical religion had not put their faith in another community of transcendent allegiance that affirmed truths built into the human condition, truths that disclosed our duties and pointed the path to human flourishing. Those who had abandoned biblical religion existed in what Dawson, borrowing an image from World War I, described as a spiritual no man's land, a cratered wasteland in which the satisfaction of personal desire was the sole focus of life. And the usually mild-mannered Dawson described the future such hollowed-out souls would create in withering terms. A secular society that has no end beyond its own satisfaction, he wrote, is a monstrosity, a cancerous growth which will ultimately destroy itself. Unless you think that such judgments are confined to dour Englishmen unhappy with modernity, consider this definition of civilization, offered just a few months ago by historians Alan Guelzo and James Hankins of Princeton and Harvard, respectively, in the inaugural essay of the New Criterion series, Western Civilization at the Crossroads. They wrote, "A civilization is a complex system of customs, practices, and beliefs that bind a society or a family of societies together over long periods of time. To survive, a civilization needs to have the means to defend itself, usually militarily and diplomatically, from external threats. It needs systems of internal order, usually defined by customs, laws, and magistrates. Above all, it needs moral and spiritual resources that generate loyalty to recognized authority and allow individuals to actualize their full potential as human beings." The world simply irreligious that Newman foresaw, and that is now unmistakably with us in the sense he intended, a world without readily available transcendent reference points in both personal and public life, is not a world in which human beings can flourish, live freedom nobly, and create communities of solidarity. That is the crux of the crisis of Western civilization today, indeed of world civilization today. For if Western civilization is so emptied of its foundational, constituting spiritual and moral ballast that it cannot lead world civilization into the future, other forces hostile to freedom and bearing distorted notions of solidarity will do so. As I've suggested before in these Simon lectures on several occasions, the civilization of the West rests on 3 mutually reinforcing pillars: Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, or to put it another way, what we know as the West was formed by biblical religion, Greek rationality, and Roman law. Biblical religion, beginning with the books of Genesis and Exodus, taught the West that the world is not an accident of cosmic biochemical forces and that history is going somewhere, that we are creatures with a noble origin and a noble destiny, creatures whose strivings are adventure and pilgrimage, not cyclical and meaningless repetition, or worse, just one damn thing after another. Classic Greek philosophy taught the West that there are truths built into the world and into us that are accessible to human reason, truths that enlighten the human pilgrimage through history, truths that form a grammar by which people of different casts of mind can engage each other in serious conversation and debate, leading to increased understanding and the enrichment of culture. The Roman Republic taught the West that the rule of law is superior to sheer coercion in ordering society and conducting public affairs. These three great learnings interacted over the centuries to produce the civilization of the West, including what was best in the various forms of the Enlightenment. And those three great learnings are also the foundations of the political expression of Western civilization, that is, democracy. Each of these three pillars of the Western civilizational project is now wobbling, if not crumbling. And the results for the democratic project are not pretty. The biblical concept of the human person no longer underwrites our civilization. Culture and society today are shaped far more by an expressive individualism in which goodness, truth, and beauty are redefined and dumbed down into manifestations of a personal willfulness detached from any givens in the human condition, including the givens encoded in our chromosomes. Confidence in reason and reason's capacity to get to the truth of things has been displaced by the postmodern notion that there is only your truth and my truth, but nothing properly describable as the truth, which is a prescription for massive, frightening cognitive dissonance throughout culture and society. And the noble idea of the law as a precept mandated by reason and enacted by a properly constituted authority for the common good of society is too often displaced in our time by the notion of law as the bludgeon by which expressive individualism is imposed on all of society. It's tempting to think that what is afoot within and among Western nations today, loss of confidence in democracy, irrational conspiracy theories across the spectrum of political opinion, the triumph of woke idiocies in the high culture and much of the corporate world, the disdain, even contempt for our history and traditions and institutions of higher learning, an intolerant cancel culture that is causing intellectual mayhem at all levels of education, the ubiquity of a grievance-based and resentment-driven identity politics in public life, the implosion of reasonable debate, the division of the media into ideological silos and a public space dominated by what George F. Will has described as the survival of the shrillest. It's tempting to think that all of these are susceptible to more or less ready fixes if only certain cringe-inducing personalities would disappear and the public temperature be commensurately lowered. It would be comforting if that were the case, and perhaps certain urgent challenges in the realm of public policy, including profligate public spending and the dangers posed to any decent world order by an aggressive China, a kleptocratic Russia, and jihadist Islam, could begin to be seriously addressed if adult voices once more came to the fore in our public life. Such a development would be entirely welcome, but it would provide only temporary remedies. The deeper problems we face would remain. For the crisis of the West in the mid-21st century is only secondarily political. It is first and foremost cultural and spiritual. Public life and its expression in politics are always downstream from culture. And if the ideas of the human person and authentic community and the narratives about human origins and human destiny that dominate a culture are so distorted that they in fact falsify reality, then the resulting politics will be rancid and ultimately self-destructive. Professors Guelzo and Hankins, in that new Criterion piece I mentioned, put the matter stringently but accurately when they warned that if the West's spiritual and moral capital is finally displaced by the cultural forces that identify progress with the satisfaction of any and all desires, then, as they put it, we will not have entered some brave new world. We will have compassed our own destruction. What the barbarian hordes of ancient and medieval times were unable to accomplish, we will have done to ourselves. Yale historian Timothy Snyder, no conservative he, laments, and in agreement with Hankins and Guelzo, that we have come to think that, quote, freedom is about giving in to impulse and complaining when that is not possible. And when we see no difference between freedom and instinct, he writes, the story of freedom ends. Who in the mid-21st century might raise the alarm about these self-destructive tendencies in our culture and summon the West to spiritual and moral renewal? In 1870, when the last remnant of the Papal States, which once governed about 1/3 of the Italian peninsula, were conquered by the forces of the Risorgimento and absorbed into the new Kingdom of Italy, the great and the good of that era assumed that the papacy was finished as a consequential actor in world affairs. That relegation of the world's oldest institutional office to the trash heap of history turned out to be a bit premature. Stripped of the usual attributes of power, the papacy was not, in fact, powerless once it discovered the power of truth-telling and moral witness. Thus, in our time, a truth-telling pope helped ignite a revolution of conscience in Central and Eastern Europe that was pivotal in shaping what we know today as the revolution of 1989 and the collapse of European communism. The papacy today does not command the kind of power that stopped an Ottoman invasion of Europe 450 years ago last month at the Battle of Lepanto. But under John Paul II, the papacy of the late 20th century deployed a potent form of soft power to bend the course of history in a more humane direction, helping end the Cold War and opening up new possibilities for the responsible exercise of freedom and the development of solidarity within and among nations. Those possibilities remain to be acted upon, and our failure to seize those opportunities since 1989 has led to many of the wounds in the body politic today. Those wounds will not be healed, however, nor will our post-Cold War possibilities be actualized if the West remains in its present state of spiritual malaise and cultural decay. In my recent book, The Next Pope, The Office of Peter and a Church in Mission, which I will be happy to sign for all of you later tonight, I sketched what a future Bishop of Rome might do for the ongoing reform and revitalization of Catholicism. In this ecumenical and interreligious setting, let me widen the lens and ask what the papacy of the future might offer that would help the West recover from what most deeply ails us. What kind of papacy do we all need? First, the world would be well served by a papacy that is consciously countercultural, challenging the zeitgeist rather than reflecting it. Second Vatican Council, meeting between 1962 and 1965, asked the Catholic Church to enter into dialogue with the modern world through a mutual reading of what the Council Fathers called the signs of the times. That sounded then, and to some it sounds now, like something rather straightforward. In fact, however, nothing is more difficult. History is always clearer in the rearview mirror, and to take the temperature of one's own historical moment is no easy business, especially amidst the cacophony we experience today. We all stumble in reading the signs of our own times. The Council's reading of the signs of its times in the late modern world was not flawless. For example, the Council Fathers imagined that a wide-ranging and mutually enriching dialogue was possible between believers and unbelievers. a dialogue between biblical religion and the morally serious agnosticism exemplified by Albert Camus, or the softer atheism of the French Marxist theorist Roger Garaudy. That dialogue, it was hoped, would reopen a conversation about the requisites of a humane modern society that had been shut down in the 18th and 19th centuries by a secularization of the European mind, which insisted that the God of the Bible was the enemy of human maturation and liberation. What the bishops of Vatican II did not expect was that their openness to a new engagement with those who had not been given or who had not accepted the gift of faith would be met with a barely stifled yawn by, to return to Newman, a world simply irreligious. Spiritual boredom on the part of one's anticipated dialogue partners is not, it turned out, conducive to serious conversation. On the other hand, the Council Fathers accurately read the signs of their time and ours by teaching that the path to a more humane future could not run through what they called offenses against life itself, such as genocide, abortion, and euthanasia, which they said poison civilization and debase the perpetrators as well as the victims. A truly humane civilization, Vatican II taught, could only be built on a dignitarian understanding of the human person, not a utilitarian one. The challenge to read the signs of these postmodern times remains. But whatever answering that challenge might mean today, and whatever a dialogue between Catholicism and the postmodern world that has followed hard on the heels of the late modern world of Vatican II might involve, it cannot mean a surrender to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. If the Catholicism of the next decades were to merely reflect the spirit of the age, if the Church were to act as if it were another non-governmental organization in the business of good works, it would not only empty itself of its own distinctive character and betray its constituting purpose, it would do the world no good service. The postmodern world, a world simply irreligious, may wish that the Catholic Church would go down the path pioneered by those liberal Protestant and Reformed Jewish communities that have become religious simulacra of progressive NGOs. That would certainly cause less trouble for the world. But it is precisely a countercultural witness and a vigorous cultural challenge that the West needs today. The West needs a Catholic Church and a papacy that acts as just such a countercultural witness, calling the West to recover the truths on which our civilization rests as the basis of cultural renewal and social reform. None of us needs a Catholic Church reflecting a zeitgeist that treats those foundational truths as poisonous. Second, the world would be well served, we would all be well served, by a papacy that affirms the goodness of creation, the givenness of things, and the true dignity of the human person. No civilization can flourish if it lacks reality contact. And no small part of the contemporary crisis of the West involves a deliberate denial of certain foundational truths the West first learned from the philosophers of ancient Greece. That there is a morally significant givenness to this world, a structure of reality in which truths are embedded, that this structure of what we might call things as they are can be known by the exercise of reason, and that the truths to be discerned by a careful reflection on things as they are illuminate the path to righteous living, human flourishing, and social solidarity. A culture that has lost confidence in its capacity to say with conviction, this is the way things are, is a culture severely disabled in its capacity to devise the way things ought to be in the ordering of public life. Why? Because in a culture without a secure grip on things as they are, the assertion of personal willfulness comes to dominate the public square to the point where society becomes a wilderness of mirrors in which there are no stable reference points, only the clash of various claims to power. The most corrosive form of this new Gnosticism, this postmodern concept of the infinite plasticity and malleability of the human condition, is gender ideology, which denies the most elemental fact of the human condition, the fact that human beings are male and female by genetic composition. This is not the way things are, gender ideologists insist, in the face of what was once regarded as definitive scientific evidence. Our gender may be assigned at birth, they claim, but by an act of will, each of us can determine what and who we really are, and we have the inalienable right to use the tools of medical technology to give effect to that choice. That there is no scientific evidence that such choices and technological interventions lead to long-term positive mental health outcomes is irrelevant to medical practice or public policy according to gender ideology. For the only unit of account that gender ideologists and other proponents of a Gnostic culture that denies any givenness within the human condition will recognize is personal willfulness. The human suffering being caused by the denial of reality that has long been embedded in the sexual revolution and that has now taken its most destructive form in gender ideology and the trans movement is incalculable, as any competent mental health professional will testify. Ideologists of choice and gender ideologists may deny the links between their deconstruction of the givenness of things and vastly increased rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide among young people, especially girls and young women, but the links are there. The world needs a papacy that addresses all this primarily by affirmation of the truth of the human rather than condemnation. Yes, the damage being done to young lives by ideologically besotted physicians who perform double mastectomies on confused and frightened 13-year-old girls and genital surgeries on similarly confused and frightened boys as young as 15 cries out for condemnation. And certain contemporary Catholic voices, appalled to the point of despair by the personal suffering and social damage caused by the ideologies of gender and choice, yearn for a root and branch condemnation of modernity in all its forms. Their concept of the Pope we all need is Savonarola 2.0, conducting new bonfires of the vanities. The larger cultural crisis of Gnosticism taking its most prominent form in gender ideology will best be addressed, however, by a reaffirmation of biblical truths about the goodness of creation, which includes the inalienable dignity and infinite value of every human person throughout the life spectrum from conception until natural death. For all of its Promethean assertiveness, the postmodern culture of the West is suffering from a drastically diminished sense of life's possibilities, the sense that the good life is one of surrendering to one transient impulse after another on a journey without a goal. But how can such impulsive aimlessness lead to personal happiness and social solidarity? The evidence of distress all around us, in individual lives and in society, suggests that it cannot. And that means that the world, as well as the church, needs a pope with the courage to proclaim a biblically rooted vision of human possibility grander than what is on offer in a world simply irreligious. That, in fact, was the public mission envisioned for Catholicism by the Second Vatican Council. The Church's fundamental mission is, of course, the proclamation of God's love for the world, revealed first to the people of Israel and then in a definitive way in the incarnate Son of God, Jesus Christ. That basic evangelical task has real effects on culture and society, however. For as the bishops of Vatican II put it, pursuing the saving purpose which is proper to her, the Church does not only communicate divine life to the world, but in some ways casts the reflected light of that life over the entire earth, most of all by its healing and elevating impact on the dignity of the person, by the way in which it strengthens the seams of human society and imbues everyday activity with a deeper meaning and importance. Thus, the Pope we all need will remind a world with a diminished sense of human possibility that biblical religion is a matter of encountering a personal mystery of love in which we learn the deepest and most ennobling truths about the human condition. The Pope we all need will confidently proclaim that even amidst the claustrophobic, frightening silence of a world turned in upon itself, men and women can hear a divine word. They can encounter and enter into communion with the God of the Bible, and in doing so, become sharers of the divine nature, as Vatican II put it in its dogmatic constitution on divine revelation. A Pope who lifts up that striking affirmation, that human beings can rise above their fears to become sharers of the divine nature, will offer the 21st century world a vision of human possibility far nobler and far more compelling than the dumbed down and infantilized notion so prominent in the world today, in the West today, that we are all merely twitching bundles of morally equal desires, the satisfaction of which exhausts the meaning of the term human rights. A Pope who teaches that human beings are far more than congealed stardust, that we have an eternal destiny beyond history that illuminates the path to individual flourishing and social solidarity within history, will help revive within the West a true humanism of nobler conception and aspiration than anything offered by a world simply irreligious, in which humanity has no intentional origin, no noble destiny, and thus no path to take through history. Third, the world would be well served by a papacy that teaches an adult understanding and exercise of freedom. The spiritual and cultural crisis of the West also manifests itself in a debased and childish notion of freedom as willfulness. One doesn't immediately think of John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas as a significant contemporary philosopher, but he neatly captured the idea of freedom as sheer willfulness in these lyrics from 1965. You got to go where you want to go, do what you want to do, with whoever you want to do it with. Nice tune, but dumb lyrics. 28 years later, 3 justices of the United States Supreme Court affirmed essentially the same thing. When in Casey versus Planned Parenthood, they insisted that, quote, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Freedom as willfulness is like a child banging on a piano, which is noise, not music. In order to make music on a piano, one has to learn certain disciplines. The mind and the fingers have to be trained through what are often dull exercises to turn the notes on a musical score, which is another form of discipline, into music, a truly human form of expression. Freedom as willfulness is also like a child babbling. While we learn our first language and other languages by listening, talking, and making lots of mistakes, truly human communication only happens when we learn the disciplines, the rules of grammar and vocabulary, so that we can really converse with others. Freedom as willfulness is, in a word, infantilism. The Pope we all need will lift up before the world, explain, and embody a far nobler concept of freedom. He will remind the world that freedom is a means to certain ends, to excellence, to happiness, and to the fulfillment of our human destiny. A fulfillment that cannot be reduced to the pleasure principle without fundamentally demeaning the human condition and the human person. He will remind the world that freedom has to do with both our reason and our will. That freedom is the capacity to choose wisely what we can know objectively to be the good, and to act on that choosing as a matter of habit. All of which is to say that the Pope we all need will remind the world that there is a natural longing for truth, goodness, and happiness built into us, and that the proper exercise of freedom grows in us as a growth in virtue. The Pope we all need will teach us that freedom tethered to truth and ordered to goodness is the path beyond the social chaos being created throughout the West by the childish notion of freedom as willfulness. The Pope we all need will teach us how an adult exercise of freedom leads to community and solidarity. Fourth, the world would be well served by a papacy that does not play international politics by realpolitik rules. Hopes that the post-Cold War world would be increasingly defined by a rules-based international order have been severely frustrated by several of the forces I noted a moment ago. An aggressive China seeking to reverse what it regards as centuries of humiliation, a revanchist Russia led by a murderer who obscenely masquerades as a defender of Christian values, various forms of jihadist Islam, each driven by apocalyptic fantasies. In addition, the cultural decay of the West and the attendant collapse of political will within and among leading Western countries have combined to give these destabilizing forces far more maneuvering room than seemed possible in the immediate aftermath of the revolution of 1989 in East Central Europe and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In this dangerous situation, the Pope we all need will learn the lesson of St. John Paul II's moral witness and become a defensor hominis, a defender of the inalienable dignity and rights of the human person. The Pope we all need will not play realpolitik games with authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, because he will understand that such games only benefit tyrants while undermining the evangelical and moral credibility of the Church and the papacy. The Pope we all need will become a voice for those who have no voice, because they are locked in Cuban or Nicaraguan prisons, or because they are being brutalized in concentration camps in China's Xinjiang province, or because they have been reduced to penury in Venezuela. In sum, the Pope we all need will lift up hearts that are weighed down by a fear of the future, the deepest cause of which is a loss of confidence in ourselves. In 1950, William Faulkner accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature with an address that resonates as powerfully today as it did 7 decades ago. Faulkner took the occasion of his Nobel Prize to lay down a challenge to the practitioners of the writer's craft who would come after him. They were, he thought, becoming paralyzed and disempowered in their day by fear of nuclear war. And so, he said, they had forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. Unless the writers of the future reclaimed what Faulkner unblushingly called The old verities and truths of the heart, the universal truths of love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice, they would fail. They would write, he said, not of love, but of lust, of defeats in which nobody loses anything of value, of victories without hope, and worst of all, without pity or compassion. They would write, he said, not of the heart, but of the glands, and they would do so because they imagined themselves watching the end of the human story. They would fail because they imagined themselves in a world with no future. Faulkner refused to accept this, and he stated his refusal with singular eloquence and passion. I decline, he said, to accept the end of man. It is easy enough to say that man is immortal simply because he will endure, that when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock, hanging tideless in the last red and dying evening, that even then there will still be one more sound, that of his puny, inexhaustible voice still talking. I refuse to accept this. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. The poet's, the writer's duty is to write about these things. It is his privilege to help man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man, it can be one of the props, the pillars, to help him endure and prevail. As for the poet and writer, so for the priest, who is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. The Pope we all need is a Pope who can say the things that William Faulkner said in Stockholm in 1950, and say them from the far greater stage that is Rome. And in doing so, that Bishop of Rome will be reclaiming for the Western world civilization the biblical view of the human person, so memorably expressed by a Jewish poet of the Iron Age, perhaps King David, perhaps someone else, in Psalm 8. What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man that thou dost care for him? Yet thou hast made him little less than God, and dost crown him with honor and glory. Thou hast given him dominion over the work of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. The cultural crisis of the West can only be resolved by a renewal of faith in the human person, a faith that draws strength from, even as it proclaims, the biblical vision of humanity's dignity, origins, and destiny, which is so much greater than what postmodern Western culture is offering. The Pope we all need is a Pope who can renew that faith, embody it in his service to the Church and the world, and summon all of us to our duties as renovators of our cultures, our societies, and our politics, building upon the noble truths bequeathed to us by Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. Thank you.